Good afternoon I'm down in Cornwall in England, but I know we have people joining us from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to this Global Government Forum Mega Trends webinar. My name is Siobhan Bonita and I'm Global Government Forum's event moderator. And in this session, myself and Global Government Forum's executive editor, Richard Johnston, will share information to help you understand the issues shaping the future of government. There's quite a lot to get through, and over the last 2.5 years, there have been lots of changes in how governments around the world are working. The public and civil services that are emerging from COVID-19 are very different from the ones that went into that period. And around the world, many public services did things differently during the pandemic. So developing large-scale economic support programs in a matter of weeks, when previous reforms to welfare systems would have taken years, to creating public health campaigns that reached every corner of their nations in the digital age, and procuring and rolling out vaccines for their populations. And while the initial response to the coronavirus pandemic has passed in many countries, governments around the world now looking to build back are also responding to an energy and inflation crisis, as well as developing and implementing plans for net zero and dealing with the increasingly evident effects of climate change. In this session, Richard and I will share some of the intelligence that we've gathered here in GGF on the emerging trends and priorities for government. And we're going to cover economy and finance, resilience and sustainability, procurement, and digital transformation. These themes broadly reflect the areas that are most requested by our civil service audience, sponsors, and knowledge partners. But we also want to hear from you about your questions, in particular on these topics. So please do submit any questions or thoughts that you have using the Q&A function. You should have that somewhere on your device that you're listening from. And at the end, when you've heard from Richard and myself, we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Now, in each of those 4 areas, we're going to discuss the key lessons that we have learned from across the work that Global Government Forum does, and how we work with you as our knowledge partners to both share your insights with our network of civil servants, over 300,000 public and civil servants, and for GGF to provide you with the insights that you need for your businesses. So first, just a little word about Global Government Forum, GGF itself. We're a media company that aims to bring together public and civil servants from around the world to share both their challenges and solutions with their peers. We do this in a number of different ways with the areas of content that we produce, including a daily news bulletin that provides information that officials around the world will find really useful, research which uses our network of senior officials to establish insights on issues that public servants are prioritizing around the globe, a podcast sharing the best of public service leadership from current and former civil servants, summits that bring together the heads of civil service and digital and finance functions from different countries in round table formats under Chatham House rules, so that those senior officials can have a frank and open dialogue about the challenges of modern government. And webinars that help share on-the-ground perspectives on major public policy challenges like the drive to net zero and how to drive government transformation. We do between 40 to 50 webinars a year and have up to 900 registrations for our most popular events. We also provide simultaneous translation for some of our webinars to make sure that they're as accessible to as wide an audience as possible. There are knowledge partnership opportunities linked to all of these for your company to get its message out to this exclusive civil service and public service audience, and we'll be highlighting a few throughout this session. But for more information on the full range of opportunities, you can contact our colleague, Commercial Director George O'Grady, and his details are there for you on the screen. And to find out more about what we are doing, please also visit globalgovernmentforum.com. Again, those details are there, or you can follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. We'll make sure you get all of this information. I think we're sending it in the chat. It's there on your screen, but we'll send it out to you as well. So without further ado, let's get into the key trends, and we'll start by getting Richard to set out the trends on economy and finance. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Siobhan, and hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar today, and thank you for joining. Yeah, as Siobhan mentioned in her opening comments, the COVID-19 response was all-consuming for governments around the world, and the finance and economic elements of that were no different. The rest of this decade is set to be dominated by what I think we could probably call the fiscal fallout from the pandemic, both the impact on public sector balance sheets from the support schemes and the wider economic impacts that have kind of unwound following COVID and the reopening of economies. When the pandemic initially struck, governments around the world implemented employment and business support schemes during lockdowns, including the employment support scheme like the Job Retention Initiative in the UK, or economic stimulus payments in the United States, as well as expanded sick pay eligibility in many countries. According to the World Bank, the economic shock from the pandemic was unprecedented in terms of its impact on public finances as the governments implemented these massive fiscal support packages. And many of these were kind of innovative approaches developed at great pace. We'll touch on the policy-making lessons that perhaps flow from that later. But the economic impact of these was such that when the countries came out of the immediate pandemic response, many governments started talking about a Build Back Better economic agenda, which was intended to kind of boost economies back to where they had been, and indeed beyond it. And it wasn't just individual governments like the UK and the US that were calling for this kind of Build Back Better agenda. The International Monetary Fund was calling for something similar, urging governments to prioritise the transformation of their economies to make them smarter, greener, more resilient and more inclusive. But then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which kind of put all the Build Back Better talk on the back burner. It sparked a massive spike in inflation and a cost of living crisis in many countries that's now dominating the day-to-day politics. Tackling inflation has therefore become probably the biggest single priority for governments. And in the latest IMF analysis, they are now saying that it also should be. Governments around the world need to implement tighter monetary policy through higher interest rates, says the IMF, which will inevitably have real economic costs, but to delay them will only exacerbate them, according to the global financial watchdog. There's a need for targeted fiscal support to help cushion the impact of that on the most vulnerable citizens, but again, the IMF says such support needs to be offset by increased taxes and lower government spending. So we're definitely not seeing governments being advised to respond to the cost of living crisis like they were advised to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, which was, borrowing was going up to fund all these support schemes. These tighter monetary conditions that also flow from tackling inflation through higher interest rates will also affect financial sustainability, increasing the interest paid on government debt, both refinancing the existing debt pile and new borrowing for deficit spending. I think then this is, probably the first trend of our session, and one that I think will kind of loom over our whole discussion. We're going to see governments working to restrain public spending in the years ahead, though there might be investment spending, especially around issues like climate change, where governments will need to put in some upfront investment. And we'd seen that recently in the legislation passed in the United States. In many countries with aging societies, there will be real pressure from finance ministries and treasuries to rein in the day-to-day spending. And this means an increased focus on how to keep government costs down, perhaps a renewed efficiency agenda along the lines of what we saw in the UK in the kind of coalition years and the the second Cameron government as well. That's definitely something to watch for. And these are definitely areas that we at Global Government Forum will be continue to monitoring. Here are some of the upcoming webinars that we have looking at economic issues. And it's definitely a topic that I think is going to be kind of dominant in the years ahead and really shape all the other trends that we are going to be discussing today. So please, as we mentioned earlier, get in touch with George if you want to be part of any of these webinars.
Thanks so much, Richard. As you say, that kind of economic context is going to shape all the other themes as we go forward, I think. So if you do have any questions on anything that we've said so far, as I say, don't hesitate to put those questions to us using the Q&A function. But I'm now going to go on to our second theme, and that's the one of resilience and sustainability. And obviously, as we said, these issues are closely linked to the economy and finance elements that Richard set out. As the discussion on the pandemic illustrates the need to build resilience in the public sector. But it wasn't just the pandemic that did so. The recent heat wave, for example, across the globe highlights the demand also for governments to take action on climate change. So these kind of set series of crises show how vital it is for governments to be able to respond quickly to change. And in order to measure how effective governments were at doing this, Global Government Forum developed the Responsive Government Survey to measure how quickly governments can respond to these kind of different changing circumstances. So the report that we did in 2021 found that 4 in 5 civil servants across 9 countries that we surveyed say their organisation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has helped their governments to develop significant new capabilities, according to a major new survey on government responsiveness. However, the results of the study also suggest that officials feel systems and cultures do not always match their ambitions and that they are often restricted by bureaucracy. And indeed, in the 2022 report that we're planning, we're going to take an in-depth look at whether those COVID-19 changes to government have been embedded into policymaking now across the country, so looking at what the legacy is. The 2021 survey revealed a number of things, including that almost 3/4 of the 873 responses agreed with the statement, "My organisation excels at learning and responding rapidly to meeting evolving citizen and end user needs," with just 19% disagreeing with that. And this overall confidence was also evident within what we call the 5 Eyes group, so US, Canada, the UK, Australia and New Zealand, where 71% of all civil servants agreed with this statement to some extent. What is more, positivity rose as seniority fell. So among 5 Eyes leaders, 67% were in agreement with the above statement. At manager level, 7 in 10 agreed. However, among frontline staff, 73% agreed with this. But the report also found that the systems that civil servants are operating within don't always make this responsiveness easy. So the high levels of confidence were not always reflected in respondents' answers about the drivers that contribute to responsiveness. And this suggests that civil servants have pride and confidence in their department and their work, but their systems and culture don't always match their ambition. Indeed, civil servants in most countries identified room for improvement in collaboration between departments, communication of decisions through the ranks, empowerment of staff and giving permission to try and fail, and ensuring end user input to the making of policy. But the most negative scores in the study related to organisations' ability to move at pace, and respondents in most countries complained about being hamstrung by unnecessary bureaucracy. As I say, we're going to rerun the survey and we'll be sharing the results of that later this year, as the importance of resilience in how government works has become more and more important as that economic outlook that Richard mentioned darkens. There are lessons from how the government responded to COVID that show how this resilience can be built in going forward. So here in the UK, for example, government streamlined its administrative processes during its COVID response, getting ministerial and administrative approvals in parallel rather than sequentially, highlighting an approach to policymaking that can now be used to quicken policymaking going forward. And this indeed here in the UK is something that's going to be tested when the new Prime Minister, come the 5th of September, takes up post and will need to urgently put in place an economic support package. And agile policymaking is also important as governments deal with the impact of climate change, which we've mentioned, and environmental sustainability. This is going to be a huge issue for governments around the world going forward. How to get to net zero is set to be the major policy issue in the decades ahead as efforts to reduce carbon emissions to net zero in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change grow. Many countries now have signed up to commitments to reach net zero. According to the website Net Zero Tracker, 136 countries have pledged to do so, most by 2050, a few a bit later than that. So this equates to 83% of global emissions. But that pledge is just the start. The same website highlights that only 63% of country level emissions are actually covered by national net zero plans that indicate how they will actually get there. So there are big debates happening in governments with civil servants around the globe on where and what to invest. And these debates have only got more pressing in the months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These conversations cover the extent to which industries need to be greened this decade with existing technology and know-how, or whether technological advances will speed progress as 2050 approaches. And these climate-related issues really always produce excellent conversations on our GGF webinars. According to Joy Airy Kim, for example, who's one of our panelists, the Green Fiscal Policy Team Lead, she's the Green Fiscal Policy Team Lead in the Economy Division of the United Nations Environment Programme. She spoke at our webinar on sustainable income fiscal policies for a green economy. So according to Joy, governments spend 3.11 trillion US dollars on recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, but less than 1/3 of that could be classed as green spending. And this represents a real missed opportunity, Joy said, and the timeline to 2050 will not allow many more, nor perhaps will people allow many more of those missed opportunities. More than half of global citizens believe governments are doing too little to address climate change, according to a study released in February from the World Economic Forum. And Global Government Forum's editorial coverage has tracked how governments' climate policies get more ambitious as their electorates do. And the recent Australian election was the latest example of this need for action, kind of citizens pushing for action and really becoming an electoral issue, where a number of MPs were elected, the so-called teal politicians who put kind of climate right at the heart of their policy agenda. So while in the UK and sadly in other countries, there's the beginnings of a political backlash from what you might call maybe the Brexit right here in the UK, in other countries like Canada and Germany, climate change action is actually winning elections. Sorry, let me just go down. So the next big milestone for governments to make their commitments on net zero will be at the COP27 event in Egypt from the 7th to the 18th of November this year, where countries will be brought together to set out their latest pledges on net zero. And here we'll be hosting a series of webinars in the build up to the COP conference. So you can see those there, 4 of those already that we've got up on our website. And they do get really good take up from civil service and public sector audiences. So if you want to join these discussions, we are still have opportunities for knowledge partners to support these events. Richard, I'm going to come over to you for our next theme.
Thanks, Siobhan. And it's a theme that's very much linked to that conversation on sustainability, because one of the key ways that governments themselves can drive sustainability and indeed kind of maintain the resilience in government and in public services is in procurement and how governments go about procurement. Government purchasing has always been an important part of what they do, accounting for a large proportion of government expenditure, probably around 1/3. But kind of taking this strategic approach to government purchasing is a relatively new idea. When I did some digging into this, I found it was only around 2008 when the countries that make up the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, committed to reforming public procurement in order to promote good governance and the whole procurement cycle. So it's definitely a long-standing challenge, but perhaps one that hasn't often received the attention that it deserves. In a 2019 update to that 2008 pledge, the OECD highlighted that the challenges of implementing strategic procurement processes are many, ranging from risk aversion across government, difficulty in setting up forms of coordination and collaboration within government, problems with improving the skills and capacity of people working in procurement, and barriers to enhancing data collection. And they really did focus in on the kind of prominent weakness in public procurement systems being the workforce's lack of capability and capacity to kind of implement these more strategic approaches to procurement, with a lack of professionalization being a recurring issue in many countries. I think you can also say, kind of looking back, that the pandemic kind of exacerbated many of these problems, at least in the short term, and definitely highlighted them. A lot of the procurement rules were suspended to allow for emergency purchases linked to the pandemic, and governments are now trying to kind of rebuild those systems and do so in a way that can create the more sustainable and resilient procurement processes that Siobhan mentioned, and can help reach those environmental and net zero aims as well. But that coordination, I think, is still definitely something that governments are struggling with around the world, and it's definitely, again, another area where there will be a lot of focus in the years ahead, and how government can use the money that it spends on goods and services to drive the net zero agenda. And it's an area that we will be looking at specifically in our Buying Right, Getting Procurement Right in the Digital Age webinar on the 7th of March next year, which I'm very much looking forward to, because I'm a bit of a procurement nerd, and there's some other knowledge partner opportunities linked to kind of public services procurement on that slide too.
Thanks, Richard. And again, procurement is another one of those areas where we always get a lot of interest from civil servants as they look, as you say, to making their procurement practices as sustainable as possible. So now we're going to move on to our last segment before we take questions from all of you. So please, just a reminder, any questions that you've got, please do send those in, and we'll get onto those when we finish this final kind of section. So this one is all about digital and transformation. And as we've said, we saw kind of during COVID-19 huge transformations in the way government works, with existing moves to home working requiring many governments to change how they operated at speed, and with public services moving online and increased use of automation and artificial intelligence in the deployment of things like support payments during the pandemic. And this kind of digital transformation, it was there before, sped up during the pandemic. It's only going to increase in future, with many governments now setting out plans to digitalize services to drive the kind of efficiency that we've been talking about earlier. In the UK, for example, a new government digital strategy has pledged that by 2025, so just in 2 years' time, at least 50 of the government's top 75 identified services will move to what they call a great standard of service delivery by embedding digital approaches and cross-functional teams into policy design and delivery. However, our research here at GGF has identified a number of barriers to realising fully digital transformations like this. And our digital leaders study interviewed senior digital leaders from 7 countries to find out why innovation like this had still not happened, and found that while governments set out visions like this, they don't often detail the levers to actually get there, the levers, the resources, or the reforms required to realise those visions and goals. And without these, progress is typically slow and shallow. Let me give you one quote that came from that research, which was conducted for GGF by the former head of the UK Government Digital Service, Kevin Cunnington, was that most strategies contain nothing objectionable and also nothing actionable. So closing the gap between strategy and vision and action, I think, is now one of government's most pressing priorities, because if services continue to lag behind citizens' expectations of kind of modern digital services, then that's going to undermine trust and confidence in government overall. And that's a really big issue for governments, that issue of trust. Indeed, President Joe Biden has said that proving government still works by improving citizen experiences of public services is one of the key tasks for his administration. And other countries, many facing kind of populist political challenges, especially amid this cost of living crisis, are also realizing that they need to do likewise and make sure that they can deliver the best possible services. The Digital Leaders research also revealed two key capabilities that governments need to focus on developing to unlock kind of this type of digital future, and that is strong digital ID systems and high quality cross-government data management. We get lots and lots of questions on these from our audience, and really, really popular conversations on these. So these two issues represent the great digital divide in governments around the world. So those that have cracked kind of this issue of citizen digital identity, they're able to kind of move ahead and create joined up transformational services, unlike those countries who have yet to crack digital citizen identity. For them, that challenge is proving to be much harder. You can find out more about the Digital Leaders report on our website, and I think we're going to share the link with you now, and we'll also make sure that you have that afterwards. So digital's one area kind of transforming the way governments work, but it's not the only area of transformation. And I'm going to hand over to Richard to talk about some of the other ways that we are seeing transformation in governments at the moment. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Siobhan. And yeah, the way that governments work has kind of changed massively by the pandemic. Obviously, digital has been a key aspect to that, but also the move to kind of remote and flexible working that's now a feature across government has changed the working lives of civil servants, really, and most of them, I think, would probably say for the better. The initial kind of shock of having to set up all remote working and things like that was handled surprisingly well, I think, by governments around the world. And there's studies that are showing that there's been no loss of productivity in that shift to remote and flexible working. And we see across the world civil servants in the UK and in Canada too, kind of trying to fight to maintain their flexible working arrangements as their employers try to return to what was the kind of status quo ante before coronavirus. I think the longer term impact of this change is yet to be seen, but it's clearly popular, as I say, amongst civil servants. And, you know, looking more broadly, it might be something that could make the public sector a preferred employer in very difficult recruitment times. Public sector pay is going to remain low, and there is a very tight labour market in a lot of countries. Could this kind of flexible working approach, if kind of embedded properly in the civil service and public services, help governments recruit the staff that they need? We know from our webinar discussions that the Canadian Public Service, for example, was looking at removing some of the geographical restrictions that it had on jobs, because people didn't need to be in the physical office as much, and this would help widen the pool of applicants. I think the kind of the wins in this area are beginning to move in a different direction towards trying to get more people back into the office, but I think it's a very interesting point to note where that gets to, and it's definitely not decided yet. It's an ongoing ongoing debate in a lot of governments. Another digital challenge that governments are facing is kind of cybersecurity and responding to the increasing cybersecurity threats. Part of that is linked to that flexible working elements. There is an increasing risk as people log on to work devices from potentially less secure networks, but that's really just the start of the cybersecurity issues that governments face nowadays, with data increasingly key to what they do and increasing threats both from kind of geopolitical instability linked to Russia and other global actors, and to hackers and people who are kind of just trying to undertake these things as kind of petty crime. These are real threats to government, and one that again comes up a lot in our research and in our webinars, how governments can kind of best handle these risks. This is very much a whistle-stop tour of these issues around government technology, and there's a lot we can get into, I think, in the Q&A session that follows very shortly. I also just want to touch quickly on the work governments are doing to use data to improve services. Government is collecting a huge amount of data, and it has for a long time, but it's not quite cracked yet how to use that data to make public services more responsive. Again, the pandemic response provided some moves in this direction. Real-time information sharing was one of the key ways that governments monitored the effectiveness of lockdowns, for example. But now governments are looking at how they can access and then act on more real-time data in areas like the economy, for example, in providing the support that that citizens need during a cost of living crisis. All that work is going on, but I think it's definitely a live issue in terms of how you embed that properly into the policy making process, and is the technology in government up to that task. And one final point to touch on in this section is around kind of diversity and inclusion. There's a lot of evidence in studies of governments and from the US government's own kind of Office of Personnel Management that diverse and inclusive public and civil service teams are a key way that governments can make sure that their services are responsive to the needs of their populations. And we've seen in 10 years of tracking diversity data through GGF's Women Leaders Index and other diversity research that many governments do have explicit efforts to increase the diversity of their public services, both to harness these ideas and to ensure they reflect their populations. But again, it's an area where progress has slowed in some cases, particularly in the UK. Recent figures showed that the diversity of the senior civil service, for example, declined over the last reporting period. So there's real issues in trying to ensure that diversity and inclusion agenda continues in governments to get that working population that's reflective of the populations at large, because I think that is another kind of underlying issue that we've spoken today, is that of trust. As Siobhan mentioned, Joe Biden made it explicit when he said that he wants to prove that government still works, and that the trust that people have in their governments and that they see governments reflecting the populations is an issue that comes up all the time at the Global Government Summit of civil service heads, where senior officials have argued that the measures of trust between government and citizens are potentially the ultimate outcome that they, as the top civil servants in a country, should be focused on. So I think that the issue of trust is another kind of overarching trend that governments are keeping a very beady eye on, particularly as has been present throughout this conversation. The economic outlook is really affecting trust ratings of governments, and that is a real concern to public and civil servants, and something that they are keeping a very clear watch on, trying to improve. And these are, of course, issues that we are very much keen to keep an eye on, both around digital and broader government transformation. We have an upcoming conference called the Accelerate Gov Conference that is being hosted in Canada, which is bringing together senior digital public servants from around the world to shine a light on how to get digitization and transformation done, how to kind of overcome some of the obstacles that Siobhan talked about, that were highlighted from the Digital Leaders report. We know there are civil servants out there who are kind of getting these, making these transformations happen, and we are going to help share their stories at that event, and indeed these other webinars that are all about getting the most out of modern technology for public servants.
Thank you so much, Richard. So as you said, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through. I know we've covered lots there in those, what we've called those mega trends. I hope that's been really useful for all of you. Please do now take this opportunity. We've got lots of questions coming in already, lots from Joss Crease. So I'm going to try and answer a bit of that myself, but also get Richard's thoughts on some of those. But please do, any questions that you've got either on the themes that we've covered, what you think civil servants are kind of going to be worried about going forward, but also just that how you might be able to get involved, some of those issues, those events that we've talked about. If you want any practical, if you've got any practical questions either about working with GGF, then please do send in your questions now. This is your opportunity to ask absolutely anything that's come into your mind during this conversation. So just turning to Joss's questions that have come in. The first question that came in was, I wonder if civil servants are looking through rose-tinted glasses when they think they excel at responding to meet evolving citizens' needs. I suspect citizens might not agree. I'm just going to give my thoughts on that one, if it's okay, Richard, before I come to you, and kind of be very honest here that as a kind of a former senior civil service servant myself, the one thing I can guarantee you, Josh, is I think no civil servant thinks they excel at responding to meeting evolving citizens' needs. I think if anything, what we found from my experience, what we found from talking to civil servants and talking, all the webinars and the conversations that we've had, the podcast, is civil servants are always worrying about how they can do things better, how they can continuously improve the services that they are providing to the public. And I think one, we have to celebrate the successes when they do that. I think you have to recognise during the pandemic the amazing work that civil servants did around the world to kind of keep things going and get payments out to citizens and put in place all those support schemes. But equally, I think any civil servant that I have spoken to now will say that they are really challenged in terms of making sure that those public services continue to meet the needs of the citizens. And everything we've spoken about today, in particular, that kind of rising to the digital challenge going forward, making sure that their services match what citizens are used to kind of in their private lives, in their other professional lives as well, I think is a huge challenge for civil servants. And that's why what we do in our events is kind of help them share good practice and help them link up with people in other sectors that might help them to kind of do that transformation in the best possible way. So that would be my thoughts on that question. But Richard, any thoughts from you on Joss's first question?
I think I would not wanting to be overly provocative. I think I would say that they are looking through rose-tinted glasses a little bit, in just so much that when you dig into the data that was behind the statistics that we mentioned from the responsive government survey, that high proportion, the 72% of people saying my organisation excels at learning and responding rapidly to evolving citizen and end user needs, that was kind of the high level question. And then once you dug into it a little bit, and once the public servants got through the rest of the questionnaire and they were actually asked about what that meant in practice, whether they had bureaucracy to overcome, whether they had the capacity that they needed in their organization, the technology that they needed in their organization to respond quickly, the scores went down. So I think there is an element of them kind of saying, yeah, you know, my organization is good because, you know, on the face of it, they have responded well to a lot of these major major obstacles in recent times. But that when they dug into it a little bit, and perhaps, you know, were slightly more reflective from the questions that were asked later in the survey, they did that confidence did wane, and there was some interesting national breakdowns as well that come from that. And I mean, the one that comes immediately to mind is the UK civil service, which was kind of particularly unconfident, for want of a word that actually exists, in its view of its responsiveness. That you got the impression, if you can get an impression through a spreadsheet, that the confidence of civil servants in the UK had really been battered by Brexit and the kind of political machinations, and that had kind of affected their scores. So, like Yvonne says, you know, I don't think there's kind of rose-tinted glasses in that civil servants think they're brilliant. I think there's perhaps, you know, surface level thinking of, yeah, we're a responsive organization, and then when you dig into it a little bit more, and when they start thinking of the kind of components that would make that up, they begin to think, well, maybe there are more obstacles than I initially thought in my first answer.
Thanks, Richard. Well, I think that links to more of Joss's questions, which are digital development at a local level is often world class, yet digital delivery at a national level often fails spectacularly. What can we learn from this? And there's also the issue here of kind of whether remote working, although liked by a lot of public servants, and I know we've done work on that, I think there is a majority of kind of civil servants and public servants do like the flexibility that they now have and kind of hybrid working. But Josh is questioning, is that best for the public? Is it making it harder for the public to get kind of joined up services to get problems solved? So again, my thoughts on this, and these are just from what the conversations that we've had in particular on the webinars, because I've chaired a lot of those webinars, is I would say on the digital development point, I think there's always things to learn from better collaboration between kind of central government and local government, and different countries will have obviously different governance structures. So you've got federal structures, you've got kind of different kind of provincial structures depending on which country you're on. But without exception, I think all of the webinars that we've touched where this issue has come up is people should be collaborating more across those levels, across those hierarchies, and there's things to learn from each other. In terms of why is it often at the national level that you get the biggest kind of failures, one of the issues I think that's come up is that just the kind of legacy systems, the kind of historic systems that you have in place. So for example, the big IT systems that you have in place when you're trying to do kind of digital transformation at that national level, those are huge barriers, I think, to some of the reforms that governments want to make, and are hugely expensive to change those systems. And as Richard mentioned, as we're getting into this climate of very tight finances, I think it's going to be really hard for governments to make those changes that they would like to do. So that's one issue, but I think there's a lot that we could unpick around innovation at a local level that maybe doesn't happen as well at a central level. So that's my thoughts on the kind of digital development thing. And just on the flexible working, and I'm not sure there is evidence that actually the hybrid working or the flexible working is leading to lower quality public services. In fact, as Richard mentioned, productivity and some kind of other performance measures went up after kind of flexible working and remote working was introduced. I think what we are seeing though, for example, in the UK, where I know a lot of services like passports, driving licenses, all of those kind of things, you know, a lot of services in the national health and social care sector, I think those are much more to do with the economics and the funding issues than they are about where the civil service, whether they're working from home or not. But I'd be very happy to hear different thoughts on that if people have different views on that. But Richard, your thoughts on kind of these two issues?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that digital development at a local level can be better than at a national level. I'm sure a lot of my friends in local government, where I used to do a lot of journalism, wouldn't thank me for saying this, but it's slightly because I think local government is smaller. They can be nimbler, but also to some extent the stakes are slightly lower in that they are not big national services that you're providing to 60 million people, and if they fall over, then everybody gets affected. It's still big numbers of people, hundreds of thousands of people, but they can take more of a risk in some of these services that I think has also in a lot of local authorities been probably more encouraged, that kind of move fast and, if not break things, at least take a little bit of a risk in a way that it probably hasn't been in national government, and I think it probably could be, but I think the balance has to be got right. The kind of corollary of that, I would say, and again, this is something that is seen a little bit in UK local government, is that exceptionally good local services do stop at rather arbitrary boundaries, so that if you've got a kind of combined authority in the UK, I know, for example, that's trying to provide services across some local authority boundaries, one piece of exceptional digital tech in one area can't be ported to another local authority. So you do kind of create islands of excellence, but they are islands, and they need to be they're not quite joined up as well as they could be in at a local level either. And on the remote and flexible working point, I would really agree with Siobhan. I think a lot of the service problems that we're seeing is a function of demand, that people went 2 years plus without having to apply for passports. People went 2 years plus without having to apply for driving licenses. So there's unnatural demand that has been created by the pandemic and has not been matched by resources. A lot of those, the services we're talking about, will be at the same level of resources as they were pre-COVID. And again, if not wanting to be needlessly contrarian, but some of those organizations weren't at the cutting edge of civil service performance before the pandemic anyway. Like, I don't think the Passport Office and the DVLA, to use the two examples that are prominent in the UK, were the best kind of performing public sector public services anyway. And I think the demand that has kind of came at them has kind of exacerbated the fault lines that were already there. It's definitely, I think, something that has to be considered and addressed. But I think if you look at it from a public service point of view, the opportunities of remote and flexible working are, I think, as I was saying in the presentation, definitely on the upside. It's going to be really difficult to recruit people in the next few years. Public sector pay is going to stay very tightly constrained. If there are other benefits that you can offer people that perhaps weren't as long-lasting in the rest of the economy as we thought they would be in the peak of lockdowns, then I think that's something that governments are going to have to embrace. We don't see that in the UK, and as I said, we don't see that kind of communal spirit in Canada either, from a lot of our readers' responses to how the return to the office is being planned there. But I do think if I was a forward-thinking minister or forward-thinking civil servant, I would definitely be thinking there's a real opportunity for us here that might not be around forever.
Thanks, Richard. It's great that Josh is so engaged. We're going to maybe take one more question from there, but if anybody else does have any other questions, please do send them in now. We've still got a few minutes left before the end of the webinar, so please keep the questions coming in. And a slightly different take on the remote working issue. And just to say, in the webinars that we've had on kind of the future of work, other issues that have come up as well, which I think are interesting for some of our kind of knowledge partners, are things like, what training and skills are managers going to need in a hybrid future? So how do you manage kind of hybrid teams? What are the different skills that you need if some of your teams working from home, some of your teams are in the office? But also there are big issues on efficiency around kind of government estate, for example, and what do you do with government offices and office space if you don't have everybody going in? There are potentially lots of benefits to downsizing maybe your footprint, your government footprint, but also using that office space differently, using it in a more collaborative, creative kind of space than if you were always all in the office as you traditionally had been before. So there's loads of issues, I think, that come up if we're on the subject of kind of remote working or hybrid working. But just on Josh's final point here, he said, I don't think so I get the impression Josh works in the public sector, design processes for remote working around citizens' needs, so rather more our own. Again, I would just stress, I think the biggest change in public services going forward is going to be this digital transformation. So I think the kind of legacy of hybrid working from COVID, there might be a few issues to work out that haven't yet been sorted. And I think, as Richard said, different countries are putting in place different approaches in terms of hybrid working. Some are requiring civil servants to go back a minimum of 2 days a week. Some are saying it's up to them. Some are limiting the geography where you can work from. Others are not. They're being very open about it. So I think there are still a few issues around how remote working works to make sure service delivery doesn't drop in terms of standards. But I really think, Josh, that the biggest transformation in terms of public services and how they're delivered to the public is going to be those digital issues that we were talking about, and moving everything as much as possible onto kind of digital delivery. And I think the issue there then, in terms of, some people, is making sure there isn't a digital divide between some people who can't access those digital services, maybe the elderly or people that have particular kind of needs. And that's something that comes up in our webinars as well. But I think that's going to have far more impact on public service delivery than whether or not a civil servant is at home or in the office. Richard, any thoughts around designing processes for the city?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably not just remote working processes that are not being designed around the citizen. It's definitely in kind of the legacy of government. It's all government services, really. Or if they were ever designed around the citizen, it was designed around a citizen 40 years ago who doesn't exist anymore. One of the things that we are trying to get to the bottom of in the forthcoming responsive government survey is the extent to which wholesale service redesign is being considered by governments. You often see digitization of services that is just layering digital on top of the existing systems, or is digitizing the existing systems but not reviewing the processes to check that the processes are the correct ones. And we want to try and work out whether that is a conscious decision that, actually they have thought about these processes, and for whatever reasons, either, genuine thought that this is the best way to do it, or other kind of organizational structural reasons, they're not changing the processes, or if it's just the case that they're just digitizing what they know, and there's no real thought as to whether there are other options out there, because I think that is, as you know, more digital services come on board, and as you know, you mentioned that target for the UK to digitize a lot of services. There is a real opportunity to revisit how public services are delivered, how people submit the information that government needs. The use of digital IDs, for example, is, you know, potentially transformative, but it needs to be accompanied by a wholesale revision of how government delivers services, and not just, you know, typing binary code where previously you piped paper forms. You have to check that the processes are correct. So I think that is a wholesale process that needs to happen in governments around the world, and it's really difficult because these systems have been built up over such a long time and for very good reasons. But we're not going to unlock the kind of benefits that you know, definitely seem theoretically possible if we just you know, continue kind of the standard digitization, I think.
And that goes back to what we mentioned in the presentation. There has been, you know, we've had experts from countries that have unique digital IDs for their citizens, and some of the work they're being able to do already in terms of joining up public services from across different government departments is quite remarkable, in a way that countries that don't have those digital IDs in place are really struggling about how they even start that process, because they don't have that kind of foundation in place. So I think that's going to be the big change going forward. And I know in the UK, for example, we've been talking about tell us once. You know, the citizen only has to, if they change their information or want to tell the government that something has changed in their circumstances, they should only have to do it once. We've been talking about trying to do that in the UK, certainly since I was there kind of 20 years ago, and we still haven't got there yet. And part of the reason is we don't have this digital ID system in place. So I think that's going to be a big challenge going forward. And that's where I think a lot of the collaboration, which might be interesting for some of our knowledge partners on the line here, that's where I think some of our kind of private sector knowledge partners can really come in and help kind of departments and civil servants to think through how they might achieve some of that, because we don't necessarily have all the expertise that we need inside government on those kind of issues.
And just to add as well, in terms of the knowledge partners and their contribution to these conversations, I mean, as I'm come at these things very journalistically, and you know, just to kind of thank the knowledge partners that take part in these sessions, because very often they have insight that I don't have. You know, a lot of our knowledge partners spend time working with government directly, with civil and public servants, and know the issues that are happening on the ground. So yeah, we would really encourage as many people are on this webinar today to, you know, get in touch with George and discuss those knowledge partner opportunities, because I think it really helps. There's a great conversation between the knowledge partners and the public and civil servants, and it really helps me as somebody who's interested in finding out what's actually happening in government. I get a great deal of insight from those conversations.
And we find that our civil service audiences, they really like kind of case studies. They like to hear from knowledge partners if they've done a kind of project with a team that's working on a similar issue to the one they're thinking about, you know, whether they've done it in Canada, Australia, or Singapore, for example. How can that be kind of translated into what they're working on in the UK or in Ireland or across Europe, for example? So, and that goes down really well with our civil service audience, to really hear how it's been put into practice in real life. Goes down very well. Richard, I think we are coming to the end. I think we've covered most of Joss's questions that have come in one way or another. I'm just going to ask one final time if anybody else has any questions they would like us to answer. If we don't get any more in the next couple of minutes. Richard, was there anything you would like to add? I would just like to say to everybody watching, as Richard said, please do get in touch. You know, if you've got any thoughts, If you think we've missed a big trend that you've been working with government and you think, wow, we haven't covered that. If there's anything that's piqued your interest and you think you would like to work with us, then please do get in touch. You've got all those links. I'm sure we'll be sending those out to you again if you registered today. But this really is your opportunity to get involved with us, and we would love to have you engaging with us. Richard, was there anything else that you would like to add before we close?
Just to reiterate that, yes, please do get involved. As I said, we've shared George's contact information, but I am on Twitter if that's an easy way for somebody to drop me any queries. Global Government Forum is on Twitter. If you want to continue the conversation informally, more than happy to. And yeah, let us know if there's anything that we've missed. It is definitely likely that there are big trends out there that we've not quite had time to cover. So yeah, if there's something that you think is worth exploring in a webinar format like this, or in kind of any of the other editorial formats that GGF does, please get in touch, because as I said, I find the intelligence from sessions like this with both public servants and our knowledge partners to be absolutely invaluable. So I hope this to be the start of the conversation.
Thanks, Richard. And one thing's for sure, in light of that kind of the kind of economic backdrop, and things are just going to get tighter and tighter in terms of resources for the public sector and for civil servants. And I think one thing that's come out very clearly from our webinars is whether we're talking about reaching net zero, procurement, making procurement more sustainable, whether we're talking about those issues around data or digital, civil servant or fintech is increasingly an issue now that we talk about. Civil servants are really clear now that they can't do this on their own, that they want to work with the best of the best from across the public sector, but also from the private sector. So you all listening, whatever sector you're sitting in, are part of the solution to those big challenges facing governments today. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been really great to have this conversation today. I hope we do hear from you very soon, and I hope that we see you as part of our events, whether that's the webinars or other events that we do going forward over the next coming weeks and months. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye for now. Thanks.